During a routine patrol, a ranger notices a house standing right in the middle of a river, a place that doesn't exist on any map. He decides to get closer, not realizing this choice will trigger a chain of events that cannot be stopped. Watch until the end, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you're watching from. The river was wide here, wider than most people imagined when they studied it on maps or saw it from designated viewpoints. On paper, it appeared as a blue ribbon, neat and predictable. In reality, it was a moving mass of cold water, heavy and relentless, pressing forward with a force that shaped the land over decades. Even after the rains had ended weeks earlier, the current still carried a low, constant power, dragging branches, smoothing stones, eating away at the banks where the soil had weakened. The sound of it never fully disappeared. It followed you like breathing, deep and steady, reminding anyone who worked in this stretch of the park that nature here did not pause just because the season had changed. The ranger had been assigned to this sector for nearly 3 years, long enough to know its moods. Early summer patrols were usually routine. The flood season left behind damage that needed to be documented. Collapsed trails, exposed roots, sections of fencing bent or torn loose, illegal fire pits hastily buried under stones. This stretch of river, however, was rarely visited by tourists. The water was too fast, the banks too steep, the access paths poorly marked and deliberately left that way. The park administration preferred it remain quiet. Accidents here were difficult to manage, rescues expensive and dangerous. His patrol today was meant to be nothing more than confirmation that the river had settled back into its channel and that no new hazards had appeared. He moved along the bank at a measured pace, boots crunching against wet gravel, the smell of damp earth and pine hanging in the air. Low clouds clung to the slopes on the opposite side, not thick enough to hide the mountains, but dense enough to soften their outlines. The river reflected the dull light in broken patterns, gray and silver rippling over uneven depths. He stopped occasionally to note erosion marks or snapped branches, photographing them with practiced efficiency. It was the kind of work that allowed the mind to drift, the body operating on routine, while attention remained loosely alert for anything out of place. He noticed the structure first, not because it stood out, but because it didn't make sense. A vertical line where none should exist. At first glance, it seemed like a trick of perspective. Perhaps a cluster of driftwood caught against a submerged boulder. He slowed, narrowed his gaze, and took a few steps closer to the water's edge. The shape did not dissolve. It resolved instead into straight edges and dark plains that the river could not have created on its own. The house stood directly in the middle of the river. It was not perched on an island or wedged against the bank. It rose from the water itself, supported by thick wooden stilts driven deep enough to withstand the current. The river flowed around it on all sides, dividing and rejoining downstream, as if the structure had always been there, and the water had simply learned to accommodate it. From where he stood, the house appeared old. The boards were darkened with age, the roof slightly uneven, the windows dull with grime. Nothing about it suggested modern construction, and yet it stood upright, stable, untouched by the floods that had scoured the banks only months before. He remained still for a long moment, letting the sight settle. His first instinct was to look away and then back again, the way one does when confronted with something the brain refuses to accept. The house remained. It did not sway. It did not list. The stilts beneath it were straight and evenly spaced, their lower portions stained darker where water levels had risen and fallen over time. A house could not simply exist here. He knew that with the certainty of someone who had memorized this section of the river from both official maps and personal experience. No permits had ever been issued for construction in the active channel. No research stations, no monitoring platforms, no private dwellings. The environmental restrictions alone made such a structure impossible. Anything placed here would have been removed, or at least documented. There were procedures for everything. This followed none of them. He pulled the tablet from his pack and brought up the digital map, zooming in until individual contour lines appeared. The blue of the river stretched uninterrupted across the screen. No icons marked a building, no annotations hinted at a structure of any kind. He cross-checked with older layers, historical overlays that showed past survey data. Still nothing. He turned the tablet off and unfolded the paper map he carried as backup, its creases soft from repeated use. He traced the river's curve with his finger. Empty. Clean. Officially, nothing stood where he was now staring at a house. The sensation that followed was not fear, but irritation sharpened by unease. If the structure existed, someone had failed to document it, or someone had deliberately chosen not to. Either possibility carried weight. He took out his radio and requested confirmation from dispatch, keeping his tone neutral. He described the coordinates carefully, repeated them, waited. The response came after a pause longer than usual. Dispatch confirmed there were no registered structures at that location. No permits, no temporary installations. When he asked whether there had ever been one, the answer grew vaguer. Records before a certain year were incomplete. He was advised to document what he found and proceed with caution. He lowered the radio and studied the house again, this time with a more critical eye. From a distance it looked abandoned, but the longer he watched, the more contradictions emerged. The roof, though aged, showed no signs of collapse. The stilts bore scars from debris strikes, but none were cracked or warped. Some sections of wood near the waterline appeared newer, replaced more recently than the rest. Fresh lumber did not belong on an abandoned structure. Someone had maintained this place, not decades ago, but recently. He scanned the opposite bank with binoculars, checking for access points. The terrain there was steep and heavily wooded, but he noticed something else. A narrow path leading down toward the water, partially concealed by brush but unmistakably shaped by repeated use. Branches had been cut cleanly rather than broken. Stones along the slope were smoothed where boots had passed over them again and again. He shifted his gaze back to his side of the river and found similar signs, faint but present. Someone had been coming here deliberately, approaching the river at specific points, choosing this place. He recorded photographs from several angles, careful to capture the relation between the house and the river's width. The current here was not gentle. It pulled steadily, strong enough to make swimming hazardous even for experienced people. Building here would have required planning, resources, and confidence that the structure would not be questioned. The more he considered it, the less plausible accidental survival became. This house had not drifted here. It had been placed. The ranger considered protocol. An unregistered structure in an active river channel constituted a serious violation. Normally, he would mark the site, notify superiors, and restrict access until an investigation could be conducted. But something about this situation resisted immediate categorization. The house was old enough to complicate ownership claims, yet too well maintained to dismiss as historical debris. Declaring it a hazard would attract attention quickly. Attention, he suspected, might already exist and might not welcome formal scrutiny. He stood there longer than necessary, listening to the water, letting the unease sharpen into focus. The river did not care about permits or records. It accepted what was placed in it and tested it relentlessly. This house had passed those tests. That fact alone demanded explanation. He took one final photograph and made a decision that would shape everything that followed. Instead of reporting the structure as a violation requiring immediate intervention, he logged it as an anomaly requiring further assessment. The wording was deliberate. It bought time to understand what he was looking at before the machinery of administration reduced it to forms and conclusions. As he turned away from the bank and began the return toward his vehicle, the house remained in his peripheral vision, dark against the pale water. He felt the first subtle shift in his sense of the landscape, the feeling that a familiar place had revealed something it had been hiding all along. Whatever that house was, it had not appeared by accident, and now that he had seen it, it was impossible to pretend it wasn't there. By the time he reached the service road again, the river's sound had faded behind trees, but the image of the house did not fade with it. It moved with him through the forest like a fixed point in his mind, as if the landscape had quietly rearranged itself and refused to return to normal. The ranger drove back to the station with the window cracked, letting damp air and the scent of pine wash through the cab, but it did nothing to settle the feeling that he had stepped into something already in motion. The longer he replayed what he had seen, the more the details sharpened. The straightness of the stilts, the odd steadiness of a structure in a channel that should have punished it, the faint signs of recent work at the waterline. It was not simply a violation or an abandoned remnant. It was an intention, preserved over time. At the station, the afternoon carried on with its ordinary noises. A radio murmured on the wall. Boots crossed the floor. Someone laughed briefly in the break room, and then the sound was swallowed by the building's bland corridors. The ranger nodded to colleagues without inviting conversation, keeping his expression steady as he moved to the desk where the patrol logs were kept. He knew the value of routine, knew how easily sudden urgency could turn into gossip, and how gossip could travel faster than any official report. If the house was nothing, then secrecy would be unnecessary. But if it was something, secrecy might be the only safe way to approach it. He opened the logbook and wrote a short entry, careful with his words. Unregistered structure sighted in the river channel at documented coordinates. Potential hazard. Further assessment required. He resisted the impulse to add speculation. The sentence was dry enough to appear routine, but it gave him what he needed, a legal reason to deviate from standard trail patrol and access the water. If anyone questioned his route later, the log would show he had acted within duty. In the equipment room, he gathered what he would need without drawing attention. A life vest, inspection gloves, a coil of rope, a carabiner, a waterproof flashlight, and a small evidence kit that contained sealed bags and labels. He took a compact camera with a wide lens and an extra battery pack. From a locker, he retrieved a slender pry bar, the kind used for lifting nailed boards in search and rescue training, and he hesitated only a moment before adding it to his pack. If the house truly was abandoned, he might need tools to enter without causing structural damage. If it was not abandoned, he might need tools for a different reason entirely. He asked dispatch for access to the service boat under the pretext of a channel assessment. The reply came quickly, too quickly, as if the request required no thought at all. That should have reassured him, yet it felt oddly weightless. He signed out the key, checked the posted weather advisory, and waited for the shift rotation to thin the yard of idle eyes. The sky outside remained overcast, the light flat and subdued. A damp wind moved in gentle pulses, carrying the smell of wet bark and river silt. It was good weather for being unnoticed. The boat was a small aluminum craft, battered by years of use, reliable in the way old tools sometimes were. The motor started on the first pull. He checked fuel, tested the throttle, and eased away from the dock, letting the current guide him along the narrow channel that led out toward open water. The farther he went, the quieter the world became, until only the motor's steady growl and the distant hush of moving water remained. The river widened ahead and the banks drew back, exposing rock and gravel bars where flood debris had collected. He reduced speed, studying the surface. A broad river could look calm from a distance, while concealing currents strong enough to twist a boat's bow and pull it sideways. As he approached the sector where he had first seen the house, he cut the motor and let the boat drift. The quiet that followed was immediate and profound. The sound of the current surrounded him on all sides, not as a roar, but as a constant, low insistence. He took out the binoculars and lifted them, searching the line of water where he expected to see nothing. Then the house appeared again, exactly where it had been, a dark, weathered form rising from the river's center. Seeing it from the water changed it. From the bank it had seemed distant, a strange object framed by landscape. From the river it became more intimate and more threatening, like a structure that belonged to the water rather than merely occupying it. He could see the lower stilts stained by repeated floods, and above that line, the newer sections of wood that caught the light differently, their grain less worn. The roof's edges were uneven but intact. The windows were not shattered. There were no birds nesting under the eaves. The house looked neglected in the way something can appear neglected when it is meant to be ignored. He restarted the motor and began a careful approach. The current pressed against the boat's side, insisting that he angle upstream and let the flow carry him toward the target. He measured the distance, gauged the drift, and kept the bow slightly turned to avoid being pinned against the stilts. The river's surface here formed subtle vortices as the structure disrupted the flow, creating small whirlpools that spun debris in slow circles. He watched a branch tumble through one of them and vanish beneath the surface for a moment before resurfacing downstream. It was a reminder. Misjudge the current, and the river would not forgive. When he was close enough to see individual nails and cracks in the boards, he cut the motor again and let the boat slide in, using the rope as a tether. The house's stilts rose beside him like legs of some patient animal. He looped the rope around a thick post, tested it, and secured the other end to the boat. The craft bobbed, tugging at the line. He waited until its movement steadied, then shifted his weight, stepping onto the lowest crossbeam and climbing up with slow precision, keeping 3 points of contact the way he had been trained. The deck was narrow and slick with moisture, but not rotten. The boards flexed slightly under his weight, yet they held. He stood still for a moment, listening. There were no voices, no footsteps inside, no sudden creak that would suggest someone shifting behind the walls. Only the river, only the wind brushing against wood. The door was shut, not barricaded, not chained, just shut in a way that felt deliberate. He expected a padlock, or at least a broken latch. Instead, there was a simple metal hasp that could be lifted and turned. It was the kind of closure used on storage sheds and work cabins. Something meant to keep a door from swinging open in wind, not something meant to stop an intruder. That detail unsettled him more than a lock would have. A lock would have declared ownership. This closure implied someone expected the door to remain closed because no one would ever come here. He raised the hasp and pulled. The door opened with a low groan, not from resistance, but from old hinges moving after a time. Damp air spilled out, thick with the smell of aged timber and river mist. He stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. The interior was not dark enough to require the flashlight at first. Clouded daylight filtered through the windows, washing the room in gray tones. The first impression was of emptiness, but not the wild emptiness of abandonment. There was no clutter, no heaps of debris, no broken furniture thrown aside. The floor was clear, the walls were bare, yet the space did not feel stripped by looters. It felt arranged. A plain table stood near one window, positioned for a view of both banks. Shelving lined one wall, holding boxes and binders. A narrow cot sat in a corner with a folded blanket, neat and dust-free. A lantern hung from a hook, its metal dull, but not rusted. The air did not carry the sour smell of decay. Instead, it carried a faint scent of oil, as if tools had been kept here. He moved deeper, careful not to disturb the room's order. The floorboards were worn, but the wear was consistent, like the path of someone who moved the same way every day. The windows were grime-streaked, yet not opaque. Someone had wiped them, perhaps not recently, but often enough to preserve visibility. He noticed the absence of certain signs. No thick webs of spiders in the corners, no droppings from rodents, no nests in the rafters. The house was used. Maybe not constantly, but enough to keep it from becoming truly dead. He pulled a glove over his right hand and touched the table's surface. It was smooth with age, but when he lifted his hand away, no dust clung to the glove. He bent slightly and examined the edges where dust usually gathered. Clean. The faintest ring mark on the wood suggested a mug had rested there. The ring looked fresh, not deeply stained. He glanced toward the cot and saw that the blanket's fold was too crisp for something left untouched for years. He forced himself to slow down. Feelings could be misleading. The mind searched for patterns that fit fear. He needed facts. He took out the camera and photographed the room from multiple angles, documenting the arrangement. Then he stepped toward the shelving. The binders were plain, with no labels visible from the front. He pulled one out cautiously and opened it. Paper filled the binder in neat stacks. Handwritten notes, printed charts, clipped pages arranged by date. The first page he saw listed water levels, weather conditions, and times. The next included notes on visibility and wind direction. He turned a few pages and found sketches of the riverbed, marked with points along the bank and arrows indicating lines of sight. The handwriting was controlled and methodical. It did not read like casual observation. It read like monitoring. He closed the binder slowly, set it back, and looked around again. The house was not a home. It was a station. He went to the window nearest the table. From here, the view commanded both the upstream channel and the downstream stretch where the river widened. Even through grime, he could see far. The house's placement made sudden sense in an unsettling way. From the center of the river, one could watch both banks without being easily watched in return. Anyone standing on shore would appear small against the trees and stone, while the observer in the house would blend into the river's middle, an object no one expected to contain a person. He examined the door again from the inside. There was no additional lock, no deadbolt. The latch could be secured from within, but only lightly. The structure relied on isolation, not strength. That suggested confidence. Confidence that no one would come, or confidence that if someone did, the response would be swift. He moved to a cabinet near the back wall and opened it. Inside were basic supplies: a roll of tape, spare pens, a small toolkit, an emergency radio battery, and a stack of sealed plastic bags like the kind used to keep papers dry. There was nothing personal, no photographs, no books, no clothing beyond a plain rain poncho. It was as if whoever used this place did not want to leave a trace of identity, or as if multiple people used it and individuality was discouraged. He walked the perimeter slowly, studying the floor. Certain boards had been replaced. He could see the difference in grain and nail pattern, subtle but present. One corner of the room bore a faint mark on the floor, a scuff that curved like the arc of a heavy object being moved. He crouched and touched it. The wood was smoother there, worn by repeated contact. Something had been dragged over this spot again and again. He rose, feeling the first true edge of apprehension. He had expected either a ruin or a trespasser's shelter. He had found something more disciplined than either, a place built to observe, maintain quietly, and left without the comforting mess of ordinary life. For a moment he considered leaving immediately, returning to the station with what he had documented and letting the administration handle it. But the thought did not bring relief. It brought a hollow image of forms filed, of bureaucratic visits planned days later, of the house possibly emptied by then, the evidence gone, the river returning to its role as cover. Whatever this was, it had survived precisely because it did not engage with official systems. If he stepped away now, it might vanish before he could prove it ever existed at all. He chose instead to continue, but with caution sharpened into discipline. He would not rummage. He would not take anything yet. He would map the interior with his eyes and his camera, building an understanding of what belonged and what did not. He moved back to the shelving and selected a different binder. This one contained older pages, yellowed at the edges. The handwriting differed, heavier and less refined. It still followed a pattern: date, weather, water levels, activity along the banks. Activity, that word recurred. It referred to boats, to hikers, to vehicles in distant clearings, to fires seen at night. It was a ledger of movement, a quiet chronicle of who came near the river. He flipped further and found that the entries were not continuous. There were stretches of time missing, not because the pages were blank, but because pages were absent. The binder's rings showed slight scratches where paper had been removed. Someone had edited the record. That was not the act of a harmless observer. That was the act of someone who understood the danger of leaving a complete account. He set the binder back and felt the room's silence press in on him. The house creaked softly as the current pushed against its stilts. The sound was not random. It came in slow pulses, like a reminder that the river was constantly testing the structure's patience. The house responded with its own quiet groan, wood against wood, nails against beams. He noticed something else then. The air inside was cooler than it should have been, not from shade alone, but from a kind of dryness. It did not smell like mold. It smelled like a space that had been protected. He glanced up at the ceiling and saw a small vent near the rafters, and below it, a faint line where dust had been brushed away. Someone had cared about airflow. Someone had cared about preserving what was kept here. He approached the cot and lifted the edge of the folded blanket. Beneath it, the mattress was plain, thin, and clean. He replaced the blanket exactly as he found it. Then he turned toward the floor again, toward the section where the scuff mark curved. The replaced boards there looked newer, and the nails were sunk more deeply than elsewhere. His instincts drew him to it, but he resisted the impulse to pry immediately. He needed to be certain. If there was a hidden compartment, disturbing it could leave traces impossible to erase. It could also signal to whoever used this place that someone had been inside. He stepped back and looked at the room as a whole, as if trying to see it with another person's eyes. From the center of the space, the observer could sit at the table and watch, could sleep on the cot without comfort, could keep records and binders, could open the cabinet and retrieve supplies. Everything was designed for function, not living. This was a workplace concealed inside an old house, placed where few would ever approach and fewer still would dare to board. Outside, the river's sounds shifted subtly, the pitch changing as wind moved across the surface. He paused and listened, and for an instant he thought he heard something else, a distant hum. It might have been a plane far overhead, or the echo of a motor somewhere upstream. The sound faded quickly, leaving only water and wind. Yet the possibility was enough. The river could carry sound in strange ways. A boat could approach without being seen until it rounded the bend. The ranger's heart rate remained steady, but his awareness sharpened. He returned to the door and looked out. The boat was still tethered, rocking gently. The river stretched empty. The far bank was still, trees dark against rock. If someone watched from shore, they would be difficult to spot in this light. And if someone watched from another boat, they could be hidden by the river's width until they were close. He closed the door halfway, not fully, leaving it as it had been when he entered. He wanted the house to look unchanged from the outside. Then he went back to the table and placed his camera down, letting it continue to record video silently. He took out his notebook and wrote brief notes, observed binders, records of water levels and human movement. No personal items, signs of recent use, partial edits to records. He kept the words tight, factual. The less he wrote, the less his own thoughts could distort what he later remembered. He returned to the suspicious section of floor and knelt. His glove traced the nail heads. These were not hand-hammered nails. They were uniform, likely driven by a modern tool. The boards were fitted too precisely for casual repair. He leaned closer and smelled the wood. There was a faint hint of preservative, the kind applied to resist water. Fresh enough that his mind registered it. He took the pry bar from his pack and held it against the seam, not inserting it yet, simply measuring. If he lifted these boards, he would cross a line from observation to intrusion. He pictured the station again, the normal day, the possibility of returning later with official backing. But the binders, the edits, the cleanliness, those details made official backing feel like an illusion. Whatever official process he initiated would travel through hands and offices, through people whose loyalty he could not measure. If the house was maintained by someone with influence, the process would not protect him. It would expose him. He slid the pry bar back into his pack. Not yet. He needed a plan that did not depend on trust. He moved once more to the shelving and selected a thinner folder, hoping for something that would identify the house's purpose more clearly. Inside were a few loose sheets with printed grids and handwritten annotations. The grids listed dates and times, and beside them, brief descriptions. Lights seen on the south bank, boats spotted without registration markings, footprints near restricted trail. The entries were not constant, but they were persistent. Whoever wrote them returned here again and again, long after any reasonable survey would have ended. He closed the folder and returned it. The room's order remained intact. He had touched nothing that could not be replaced exactly. Still, he felt as if the house itself had taken note of him. It was an irrational thought, but it rose from the same place as the instinct that had kept him alive in storms and wildfires. The sense that a quiet landscape could hide a sudden change. He checked the time. He had been inside longer than he intended. He needed to leave before dusk lowered visibility further. Yet he did not want to depart empty-handed. If someone discovered his presence later, he wanted something solid, something that could not be dismissed as a misunderstanding. He took the camera and photographed the most telling objects, the binders, the table positioned at the window, the cabinet supplies, the replaced boards. He captured the latch on the door, the lack of a true lock. He took a final sweeping photograph of the room. Then he slipped the glove off and sealed it in a plastic bag, a habit from evidence handling. If this turned into an official matter later, he wanted to show he had acted with care from the start. At the threshold, he paused again, letting his eyes sweep the river. The water moved as it always had, indifferent and constant. The house stood in its center like an answer waiting to be asked. He stepped onto the deck, climbed down, and returned to the boat. The current tugged at him immediately, impatient, but the tether held. He untied the rope and pushed off, keeping the bow angled into the flow until he had room to turn. Only then did he restart the motor. The engine's sound felt too loud in the quiet. He glanced back once and saw the house receding, small now, its windows staring blankly across the water. As the boat cut downstream, he kept his speed moderate, scanning the surface for signs of another craft. He saw none, yet the sense of being watched lingered like dampness that would not dry. He did not tell himself it was paranoia. He told himself it was professionalism. The house was unregistered, maintained, and built for observation. That meant someone had wanted to see without being seen. And now, for the first time in years, perhaps decades, someone had entered without permission and walked through its ordered silence. By the time he returned to the station's dock, twilight had begun to settle. The sky remained overcast and the forest darkened as if absorbing the last light. He secured the boat, signed it back in, and kept his demeanor plain. If his face revealed too much, questions would follow. If questions followed, attention would sharpen. And if attention sharpened, whatever lived behind that house's quiet discipline might move quickly to protect itself. He walked back to his desk, sat down, and reviewed the photographs on his camera screen. Each image confirmed what his instincts already knew. The house was a station, not a ruin. The records were real. The order was deliberate. The recent repairs were undeniable. He stared at the image of the replaced floorboards until his eyes began to ache. He had not lifted them, but he could not shake the certainty that something lay beneath. Something heavy enough to require precision, something valuable enough to justify a house in the middle of a river. He wrote a second brief note in his private notebook, not in the official log, describing the interior in careful terms. He did not mention suspicion, only observations. Then he closed the notebook, slid it into his locker, and locked it. Outside, the river continued to move through the darkening valley, carrying its secrets as it always had. The ranger knew he would return to that house. He also knew, with a calm that made his stomach tighten, that the next visit would not be the same. Observation had its limits. If he wanted the truth behind that unregistered structure, he would have to cross from looking into uncovering. And once he did, there would be no way to pretend he had not seen what lay beneath the floor. Sleep came late that night and without rest. The ranger lay awake long after the station had gone quiet, listening to the distant hum of generators and the occasional crackle of the radio in the corridor. Whenever he closed his eyes, the interior of the house returned to him in precise fragments. The table aligned with the window, the binders arranged by age, the faint curve in the floor, where something heavy had been dragged more than once. By morning he understood that whatever lay beneath those boards was not the beginning of the mystery, it was its anchor. The binders were older than the repairs, older even than the sense of caution that clung to the house. They were the reason the structure existed at all. He waited until the shift rotation changed and the station grew quieter before removing the camera from his locker. He reviewed the photographs slowly, not for confirmation, but for patterns. The arrangement of the shelves was deliberate, the oldest materials placed farthest from the door, the newest closest to the table. Whoever worked here had wanted quick access to recent observations, while keeping the deeper past physically distant. It was a subtle hierarchy, but one that suggested long-term use rather than a single occupant's habit. He returned to the river that afternoon under the same procedural justification as before, careful to keep his movements unremarkable. The sky remained overcast, the light flat enough to hide small details from casual eyes. When he reached the house again, the river looked unchanged, but he did not trust that appearance anymore. The water never showed its full story on the surface. Inside, the air was exactly as he had left it. The door latch bore no new scratches. The table remained bare, the cot undisturbed. That in itself told him something. If someone had returned since his last visit, they had done so with care equal to his own, leaving no obvious sign. Or they had not returned at all, trusting that the river in isolation would protect the house better than locks ever could. He went straight to the shelving and removed the oldest binder first. Its cover was faded nearly to gray, the edges soft from handling. When he opened it, the paper crackled faintly, the sound of something that had survived moisture and time only because it had been protected deliberately. The first pages were simple tables listing dates, river levels, rainfall, temperature, and flow rate. It looked at a glance like a legitimate hydrological log. But as he turned the pages, additional columns appeared, written in a different ink and a different hand. Movement along South Bank. Two individuals, midday. No markings on boat. Stopped briefly near bend. Campfire visible after dark. Restricted zone. No intervention. Vehicle parked near Old Access Road. Left before dawn. The entries were sparse but consistent. They did not describe weather for its own sake. Weather was context. The true subject was human presence. The ranger felt a tightening in his chest as he read. This was not casual curiosity. It was systematic attention. He examined the handwriting closely. The earliest entries were written in firm, block-like script, efficient and restrained. Later sections showed a looser hand, slightly slanted, suggesting a different writer. Still later, the writing became neater again, but with subtle differences in spacing and pressure. At least 3 people, he thought, possibly more. The house had outlived its keepers. As he moved deeper into the binder, the tone of the notes shifted. The observations became more specific. Times were recorded to the minute. Distances were estimated. Angles of visibility were noted. Small sketches appeared in the margins, rough outlines of the river bend, with arrows indicating sight lines from the house to the banks. These were not the notes of someone enjoying solitude or tracking wildlife. These were operational records. He turned to the next binder, then another. Each followed the same structure, though the level of detail varied by year. Some periods were dense with entries, others thin. He noticed that during years when the park had increased patrols in the area, the records grew sparse. When staffing decreased or funding shifted elsewhere, the observations increased again. Whoever maintained the house had adjusted their activity to match official presence. They knew when to be quiet. The ranger paused, aware of how deeply this knowledge unsettled him. It meant the observers were not outsiders unfamiliar with the park's rhythms. They understood the system. They understood schedules, patrol patterns, blind spots. They understood enough to remain invisible for decades. He reached a binder whose spine bore a faint pencil mark, a small circle rather than a date. Inside, the pages were different. Interspersed with observation logs were copies of newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, carefully flattened and taped into place. Headlines spoke of a disappearance years ago, a case that had once dominated regional news before fading into speculation and rumor. 2 men gone after a night near the river. Official cause undetermined. Suspected accident. Investigation concluded. The ranger remembered the story vaguely. He had heard it mentioned during training, not as a warning, but as a footnote. Dangerous river. Unpredictable currents. Tragedies happen. The park used such stories to reinforce safety guidelines, nothing more. Here, in the middle of the river, the story took on a different shape. Margins around the clippings were filled with notes. Short phrases, carefully written, timeline inconsistent, witness statements altered, evidence unaccounted for. Official narrative stabilized too quickly. The language was restrained, but the meaning was clear. Someone had questioned the outcome long after the case was closed. He continued reading and found references to an object, never named directly, only described through shorthand symbols and numbers. Stored separately, condition stable, do not relocate, jurisdiction unclear. Several pages later, the references stopped abruptly. The following section of the binder contained empty rings where pages had once been. The scratches on the metal were clean and deliberate. Those pages had not fallen out. They had been removed intentionally. The ranger closed the binder and sat back on his heels, letting the weight of it settle. The house was not merely watching people. It was preserving a narrative that contradicted an official version of events. And someone, at some point, had decided that parts of that narrative were too dangerous to keep intact. He opened another binder, this one more recent. The paper was white, the ink fresh. The entries here were shorter, more cautious. Many simply noted, no significant activity. But others stood out. Ranger patrol increased, weekday afternoons. New staff member assigned to sector. Observes banks more frequently, likely curious. Monitor response. His breath slowed, then steadied. There was no mistaking it. The observer had noticed him before he noticed the house. His arrival in this sector had been logged. His habits assessed. He felt a brief, sharp flicker of anger, quickly suppressed. Emotion would cloud judgment. He needed clarity. He checked dates and confirmed his suspicion. The note appeared shortly after his reassignment 3 years earlier. Another entry followed weeks later. Continues routine patrols. No deviation yet. And then, months later, unscheduled stop near Bend. Took photographs. Possible awareness. The ranger closed his eyes for a moment, then reopened them. He had crossed an invisible threshold long before setting foot on the deck. His presence had been observed, measured, and recorded, just like every other person who approached the river too closely. He methodically photographed the most telling pages, careful to capture dates, handwriting differences, and the clipped sections. He did not remove anything. The absence of pages told its own story. Removing more would only draw attention. Instead, he committed as much as he could to memory, reading slowly, reconstructing timelines in his head. The longer he worked, the clearer the pattern became. The house functioned as a passive surveillance point, not for immediate intervention, but for long-term knowledge. It tracked who came, how often, and under what circumstances. It recorded changes in official presence and adjusted accordingly. It preserved information selectively, editing itself over time to protect something central and immovable. And that something, he was certain now, lay beneath the floor. The realization brought with it a shift in his thinking. If the object beneath the boards had been merely evidence, it would have been moved when the observers changed. If it had been valuable, it would have been stolen. If it had been dangerous, it would have been destroyed. Instead, it remained here, anchored to the structure itself, protected by obscurity and jurisdictional ambiguity. It was not meant to be used. It was meant to exist, silently, as proof that could not be erased as long as someone remembered where it was. A faint sound reached him then, subtle enough that he might have ignored it on his first visit. The distant echo of an engine, low and intermittent. He stood and moved to the window, peering through the grime. Far upstream, barely visible against the dull water, a dark shape moved slowly along the bend. A boat, perhaps. Too far to identify, too distant to confirm intent. It could have been a fisherman. It could have been nothing, or it could have been someone checking. He stepped back from the window and returned the binders to their exact positions. The house creaked softly as the current shifted, and for a moment he imagined the structure responding, settling around its secrets. He replaced the last binder and took a final look at the shelving. The absence of labels was no longer curious. It was deliberate. Names could be traced. Numbers and patterns could not. Before leaving, he made a decision. He selected one small sheet from the most recent binder, a page that contained nothing incriminating on its own, only a list of water levels and weather notes. He folded it carefully and placed it inside his jacket. It would serve as a test. If someone noticed its absence, he would know that the house was being monitored still. If no one did, he would have bought himself a measure of uncertainty. He closed the binder, straightened the shelf, and moved toward the door. Outside, the river continued its endless motion, indifferent to records and memories. He stepped back onto the deck, untied the boat, and pushed off, letting the current carry him away from the house once more. As the structure receded behind him, smaller now but no less significant, the ranger understood that the records were only the surface layer of the truth. They documented what had been seen, not why it mattered. The missing pages, the careful edits, the sustained maintenance of a place that officially did not exist, all pointed to a deeper purpose. By the time he reached the bank, the engine sound upstream had vanished. Whether it had ever been real or merely carried by the river, he could not be certain. But the thought followed him as he secured the boat and made his way back along the trail. Someone had been watching this river for a very long time, and now that he had read their records, the river was watching him in return. He did not return to the house immediately after leaving it that afternoon. The awareness that his own presence had already been logged, perhaps evaluated long before he understood what he was looking at, forced him to slow down and rethink the rhythm of his actions. The binders had changed the nature of the discovery. What had begun as an unregistered structure had become a place of sustained intent, and intent always implied people. People with patience, resources, and the discipline to wait. If he moved too quickly now, he would confirm whatever conclusions had already been drawn about him. For 2 days he stayed away from the river, performing his duties with deliberate normalcy. He walked trails, checked signage, logged minor erosion, and spoke with colleagues in the casual, surface-level manner that kept questions from forming. At night, he reviewed his photographs again and again, comparing angles, zooming in on the replaced floorboards, tracing the faint curve worn into the wood. The scuff mark was not random, it had direction. Something heavy had been moved from one position to another, repeatedly with care. And then eventually it had been fixed in place. On the third morning he returned. The weather had shifted slightly. The air was cooler, the clouds higher, the light clearer. It was the kind of day when details sharpened instead of blurring, when the river revealed its texture instead of hiding it behind glare. He chose this moment deliberately. If someone watched the house from afar, they would see nothing unusual in a ranger conducting another inspection. Routine, repeated, predictable. That was the disguise the observers themselves had relied on for decades. The approach felt different this time, not because the river had changed, but because his purpose had. He did not scan the banks for movement as anxiously as before. Instead, he focused inward, controlling his breathing, grounding himself in procedure. He was no longer a curious trespasser. He was an investigator, whether officially recognized or not. The boat drifted toward the house under careful control. The current tugged at it with familiar insistence, but he compensated easily, securing the line and climbing onto the deck with practiced efficiency. The boards held his weight as before. The door opened with the same tired groan. Nothing about the exterior suggested recent disturbance. If someone had visited since his last departure, they had done so without leaving a trace visible from the outside. Inside, the air was unchanged. The faint dryness, the smell of old wood and oil, the absence of decay. He closed the door behind him, not fully, leaving it in the same position he had found it. Then he stood still, listening. The house answered only with the soft, rhythmic creak of its joints responding to the river's pressure. No footsteps, no voices. No sudden silence that might suggest a presence withdrawing. He went directly to the area of the floor that had drawn his attention before. The replaced boards looked even more obvious now that he knew what to look for. Their grain ran in a slightly different direction. The nail heads sat deeper, flush with the surface in a way the older boards did not. Whoever had installed them had wanted the repair to disappear under casual inspection, but they had also wanted it to last. He knelt and ran his gloved fingers along the seams, feeling for irregularities. The boards were tight, fitted with precision. This was not a hasty cover-up. It was a structural modification. He removed the pry bar from his pack and set it beside him. The moment felt heavier than he had expected. Once he lifted these boards, there would be no pretending he had merely observed. The act itself would be a declaration, a message to whoever had maintained this place that their silence had been broken. He paused, not out of fear, but out of respect for consequence. Then he positioned the pry bar carefully at the narrowest seam and applied slow, steady pressure. The wood resisted at first, then yielded with a muted crack that sounded far too loud in the quiet room. He froze, listening. The river continued its endless motion. No other sound followed. He worked methodically, loosening one board at a time, lifting them just enough to free them without splintering the edges. He stacked them beside him in the exact order he removed them, noting their orientation, committed to replacing them later if necessary. Beneath the boards lay a secondary layer of protection, a sheet of treated plywood, sealed along the edges with a dark, hardened compound. It was intact, unwarped, and dry. That alone told him this space had been engineered deliberately. Moisture control in the middle of a river was not something achieved by accident. He cut through the sealant with the edge of the pry bar and lifted the plywood panel. Cool air rose from beneath, carrying the faint metallic scent of something enclosed for a long time. He angled his flashlight downward and saw the outline immediately. The box filled the cavity beneath the floor almost completely. It was rectangular, industrial, its surface dark with age but free of rust. Thick metal bands wrapped around it, bolted directly into the house's supporting beam. This was not a container meant to be moved. It was anchored, made part of the structure itself. He crouched lower, shining the light across its surface. There were no labels, no identifying marks, no serial numbers visible at first glance. The metal bore faint scratches, the kind left by careful handling rather than impact. The edges were sealed with a gasket that had long since hardened but remained intact. The lid was secured by a recessed locking mechanism, old in design but sophisticated enough to resist casual tampering. The weight of it became apparent the moment he touched it. Even without lifting, he could feel the mass beneath his fingers, dense and unyielding. Whatever lay inside was not large, but it was substantial. He checked the bolts anchoring the box to the beam. They were thick, tightened with care, their heads marked with paint that had been applied to indicate tampering. The paint was unbroken. No one had opened this box recently. Perhaps no one had opened it in years. The Ranger leaned back slightly, letting the reality of it settle. This was not a stash hastily hidden in fear. This was a long-term decision. Someone had chosen to fix this object here, to build a house around it, to maintain that house quietly over decades rather than relocate the box to a safer, more conventional hiding place. The conclusion pressed itself into his thoughts with growing clarity. The box could not be moved without creating a record, without crossing boundaries that someone had gone to great lengths to avoid. He examined the locking mechanism more closely. It was mechanical, not electronic, requiring a specific tool or key. There were no signs of forced entry, no scratches around the lock that would suggest repeated attempts. The box had been opened before, but not often. Each opening would have been deliberate, calculated. He took photographs from multiple angles, documenting the box, the anchoring bolts, the cavity beneath the floor. Then, with a decision that felt inevitable, he began to work the lock. The mechanism resisted at first, then responded with a subtle shift, a quiet click that echoed more loudly in his mind than in the room. He held his breath as he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in fitted padding that had yellowed with age, lay a single object. It was unremarkable at first glance. Not ornate, not large. It looked like something that could be overlooked on a desk or in a drawer without comment. Its surface showed signs of handling, faint wear along the edges where fingers had rested. There was nothing about it that suggested intrinsic value, and yet he recognized it. Not from personal memory, but from training materials, from archived case summaries he had skimmed years ago without much thought. This object, or one exactly like it, had been listed as a key piece of evidence in the disappearance case whose clippings he had found in the binders. According to official records, it had been lost during the initial search, possibly swept away by the river. Its absence had been one of the reasons the investigation had stalled and ultimately closed. Here it was, intact, preserved, hidden in the middle of the river. The implications unfolded rapidly and without mercy. If this object had not been lost, then the official narrative was false. Not mistaken, not incomplete, but constructed. Someone had removed the evidence from circulation and replaced uncertainty with finality. The disappearance had not remained unsolved because the river was unpredictable. It had remained unsolved because the truth had been inconvenient. The Ranger did not touch the object at first. He studied it, letting the reality of it imprint itself on his mind. This was the thing the observers had protected, the reason the house existed, the reason records had been kept and edited. This object was not dangerous in itself. It was dangerous because of what it proved. He finally lifted it with gloved hands, feeling its weight, its solidity. It fit perfectly in his palms, as if designed to be carried. He searched it for markings and found them exactly where he expected, subtle and easily missed unless one knew to look. The markings matched the archival description precisely. There was no doubt. A distant sound reached him then, faint but unmistakable. An engine, closer this time, its rhythm irregular as it fought the current. He froze, the object still in his hands, and listened. The sound rose and fell, then steadied. Someone was on the river. He replaced the object in its padding quickly, closed the lid, and secured the lock. The bolts remained untouched. He lowered the plywood panel back into place, pressed the sealant as close to its original shape as possible, and replaced the boards in the exact order he had removed them. When he finished, the floor looked unchanged. Only he knew what lay beneath. The engine sound faded again, swallowed by distance or perhaps by intention. He stood and wiped his hands on his trousers, forcing his breathing to slow. The house creaked softly, indifferent to the revelation it concealed. The ranger understood now why the box had been anchored instead of hidden elsewhere. Land could be searched. Water could be dredged. But this place existed between categories, in a jurisdictional blind spot where responsibility dissolved. The river belonged to everyone and no one at once. What was hidden here could be denied by all. He gathered his things, taking one last look around the room. The binders on the shelves seemed different now, no longer mysterious, but explanatory. They were the guardians of context, the quiet witnesses that ensured the box would never be truly forgotten, even if its contents were never used. At the door, he paused again, listening. The river answered. Nothing else. He left the house as he had entered, quietly, carefully, leaving no visible sign of disturbance. As he descended to the boat and untied the line, he felt the weight of the discovery settle into him. The danger was no longer abstract. It was specific, measurable, and tied directly to his actions from this moment forward. As the boat pulled away and the house receded into the river's vastness, the ranger understood that finding the box had changed the balance irrevocably. The truth it contained could not be unseen. And now that he knew it was real, the question was no longer whether someone had hidden it here, but whether anyone would allow it to remain hidden now that he had uncovered it. The weight of what lay beneath the floor followed him long after the house disappeared behind the bend in the river. He did not hurry back to the station. Speed would only sharpen attention, and attention was now the one thing he could not afford. Instead, he let the current carry the boat downstream at a steady, unremarkable pace, watching the banks with the detached awareness of someone who understood that observation could move in both directions. The river no longer felt neutral. It felt structured, as if its bends and currents had been measured not just by water, but by intention. That night, he spread his materials out in the privacy of his quarters. Photographs, handwritten notes, timelines reconstructed from memory. He did not place the images of the object itself at the center. Instead, he began with geography, the river's course, the exact position of the house, the invisible boundaries that governed the land on either side. As he traced those lines, the logic emerged with quiet clarity. The house stood in a zone that belonged to no single authority. The river marked a boundary between jurisdictions, but the active channel itself fell into a gray area rarely examined unless a disaster forced the issue. The land beneath the water was not parceled the way dry ground was. Permits overlapped. Responsibilities blurred. Enforcement depended on cooperation between agencies that preferred not to complicate their mandates. It was a gap in the system, small but stable, and someone had recognized it long ago. He thought back to the binders, to the meticulous records of patrol schedules and staff rotations. Whoever had chosen this place had done more than hide an object. They had embedded it inside an administrative blind spot. The box was not concealed by darkness or depth. It was concealed by process. The next morning, he tested that conclusion carefully. He accessed public land records, environmental assessments, and historical zoning documents, working through official channels that left trails but raised no alarms. He did not search for the house directly. Instead, he searched for anything that might explain its absence. Construction permits, temporary research stations, decommissioned monitoring platforms. The results were consistent in their emptiness. The space the house occupied had never been formally acknowledged as a space at all. He widened the scope of his search, pulling archived correspondence between agencies responsible for the river over the past several decades. The documents were dry, technical, and frustratingly vague. References to shared oversight, mentions of non-exclusive management zones, language designed to prevent responsibility from settling anywhere for too long. It became clear that no one had ever wanted to define the river too precisely. Precision invited obligation. As he read, the significance of anchoring the box beneath the floor deepened. If the object had been stored on land, it would have required a custodian, a facility, a ledger. If it had been submerged in the river, it could have been lost to erosion or discovered accidentally. But placed here, inside a structure that technically did not exist, it could be acknowledged by none and denied by all. Anyone asked about it could truthfully say they had no jurisdiction, no knowledge, no authority. The ranger leaned back and closed his eyes, letting the realization settle. The house was not a hiding place in the traditional sense. It was a loophole made solid, a way to preserve something indefinitely without ever having to admit to preserving it. His thoughts returned to the object itself. Its simplicity now seemed deliberate. An elaborate item would have drawn attention, demanded explanation. This object could pass unnoticed by anyone who did not know what to look for. Its power lay not in its appearance, but in its context. In the fact that it contradicted an official conclusion so cleanly that there would be no room for reinterpretation if it resurfaced. He wondered how many people had known of its existence over the years. The binders suggested a lineage of watchers, each inheriting the responsibility without ever formalizing it. Perhaps they believed they were safeguarding justice, waiting for a time when the truth could be revealed safely. Or perhaps they were ensuring that the truth would never be used, keeping it out of circulation while maintaining the illusion that it still existed somewhere, lost to chance. The difference mattered. One implied conscience, the other implied control. Over the following days, the ranger observed his surroundings with a heightened sensitivity. Conversations at the station felt subtly different, though no one said anything overt. A question about his patrol route lingered a moment too long. A casual remark about river access came from someone who had never shown interest before. These were not accusations, but they were signals. He did not know whether they were intentional or the result of his own sharpened awareness. Either way, he responded with practiced normalcy, keeping his answers vague and his demeanor steady. He returned to the river only once during that period, approaching from a different access point, careful not to establish a predictable pattern. From a distance, he observed the house through binoculars. It looked unchanged. No movement on the deck. No sign of boats nearby. Yet the sense of watchfulness persisted, not tied to any specific threat, but to the knowledge that systems, once activated, rarely stopped on their own. One afternoon, he noticed a vehicle parked near an old service road that had not been used in years. It was unmarked, its windows tinted, its presence plausible but unnecessary. By the time he approached on foot, it was gone. He logged nothing. Logging would have implied certainty, and certainty was dangerous. In the quiet moments, he considered his options. He could report the object formally, forcing the issue into the open. The result would likely be swift containment. The object would be seized, cataloged, and then quietly reclassified or misplaced once again. The house would be declared a hazard and removed, its absence explained as routine maintenance. The official record would absorb the anomaly and neutralize it. Alternatively, he could remain silent, preserving the object's existence, but allowing the lie it contradicted to persist unchallenged. That path offered safety, but at a cost he was no longer sure he could accept. The truth, once known, exerted its own pressure. Ignoring it required more effort than acting on it. He also considered a third path, one that did not rely on internal processes alone. External oversight, independent review, public exposure, each carried risks not only to his career, but to his personal safety. The binders made it clear that people who approached this truth too closely in the past had been watched carefully. What had happened to them after remained unclear. As the days passed, his understanding of the house's purpose sharpened into something close to respect. Not approval, but acknowledgement of design. The observers had not been reckless. They had been patient. They had chosen a place that allowed time to do the work of concealment. The river had erased footprints, blurred boundaries, and discouraged curiosity. The house had stood quietly, neither fully hidden nor openly declared, waiting for someone with the right combination of authority and doubt to notice. That someone, it seemed, was him. Late one evening, as he reviewed his notes yet again, he noticed a pattern he had missed before. Several of the observation entries coincided with moments when internal reviews or audits had occurred within the park administration. During those periods, the records became sparse, almost silent. Then once the reviews passed, activity resumed. The house had not merely watched the river, it had watched the institution responsible for the river. The implication unsettled him deeply. This was not the work of an isolated individual or even a small group acting independently. It was the residue of an understanding between systems, an agreement never written down but consistently honored. The truth was not hidden because it was dangerous in itself. It was hidden because revealing it would force accountability that no one wanted to claim. The ranger closed his notebook and sat in the dim light of his room, listening to the distant sound of the river carried faintly on the night air. The place that did not exist had shaped events for decades without ever appearing on a map. It had done its work quietly, efficiently, relying on the assumption that no one would ever question the absence itself. Now that absence had been noticed, he knew that whatever step he took next would change the balance that had held for so long. The house, the box, the records, all of it existed in a fragile equilibrium sustained by silence and neglect. To disturb it openly would invite resistance. To leave it untouched would make him complicit in preserving a lie. As he prepared for sleep, he understood one final thing, with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The danger was not the object beneath the floor, nor the house in the river. The danger was the knowledge of how easily truth could be set aside when it occupied a place no one was required to acknowledge. And now that he knew where that place was, the responsibility could no longer be shifted downstream. The first official response arrived quietly, almost politely. 2 days after his last return from the river, an email appeared in his internal inbox acknowledging his earlier note about an unregistered structure. The language was careful and non-committal. Further review required. No immediate action recommended. Continue standard patrols unless conditions change. It was the kind of message designed to settle a matter without ever resolving it, to create the appearance of engagement while ensuring nothing actually moved. He read it once, then again, noting what was absent. There were no follow-up questions, no request for coordinates, photographs, or additional detail. No mention of interagency consultation. The system had registered the anomaly and chosen, at least for the moment, to let it rest. That choice confirmed what he already suspected. Silence was not a gap. It was a decision. He did not reply. Instead, he printed the email and placed it inside his private notebook, adding it to the growing archive he kept separate from official logs. The separation had become instinctive now. Anything that passed through formal channels could be altered, delayed, or erased. What he kept for himself remained intact, at least for as long as he could protect it. Later that morning, he returned to the river under the same procedural cover as before. His movements were deliberately routine, his timing consistent with earlier patrols. If someone was watching, he wanted them to see nothing new. From a distance, the house appeared unchanged, its silhouette steady against the dull sheen of water. The river flowed around it as it always had, carrying branches and foam past the stilts with indifferent persistence. Inside, however, something was wrong. He sensed it before he could identify it. The way one notices a room feels different even when every object appears to be in its place. The air was the same, the light unchanged, but the house no longer felt neutral. It felt adjusted. He moved slowly, retracing the path he had taken on previous visits. The table stood where it always had. The cot remained neatly made. The cabinet doors were closed. Yet when he reached the shelving, his eyes caught on a subtle discrepancy. One binder sat a fraction of an inch farther back than the others. The difference was so small, it might have escaped anyone not already attuned to order. He pulled the binder free and opened it. Several pages were missing. Not torn out roughly or removed in haste, but extracted cleanly, the metal rings bearing faint, fresh scratches that reflected the light differently than before. The missing pages were not random. They were the ones he had photographed, the ones that linked recent observation entries to specific patrol patterns and administrative changes. The house had been edited again. He closed the binder and checked the others. 2 more showed similar signs. Sections gone. Gaps where continuity should have been. Whoever had done this knew exactly what to remove and what to leave behind. The remaining records still told a story, but it was a softer one, less accusatory, easier to dismiss as overinterpretation if brought forward later. The ranger felt a tightness settle in his chest, not panic, but something colder. This was confirmation. His presence had been noticed, his actions inferred, and the response had been precise. No confrontation, no warning, just subtraction. He moved to the floor and knelt where the concealed cavity lay. The boards were intact. The sealant appeared undisturbed. If the box had been accessed, it had been done with extraordinary care, or not at all. He did not open it again. There was no need. The message had already been delivered. He replaced the binder and stepped back, scanning the room for any other change. Near the door, a faint scuff mark crossed the floor where none had been before. It was shallow, almost imperceptible, but it ran perpendicular to the usual pattern of wear. Someone had stood there for a time, shifting their weight, perhaps listening, waiting. He left the house without lingering, securing the boat and returning downstream with controlled urgency. By the time he reached the bank, his mind had already moved ahead to the next stage. Observation was no longer enough. Whatever system had sustained the house was now active again, responding to him. That meant time was narrowing. The escalation came sooner than he expected. 2 days later, smoke rose from the river. It was visible from the ridge trail, a thin gray column lifting into the low sky where no fire should have been. The ranger stopped where he stood, binoculars already in his hands, his heart steady but heavy. The smoke was too focused, too contained to be a natural fire. It rose from the precise bend where the house stood. He did not run. Running would draw attention and change nothing. Instead, he followed protocol, reporting the smoke as a possible hazard and requesting clearance to approach. The response came back quickly this time. Fire response already notified. Maintain distance. Await instructions. He did not await them. By the time he reached the riverbank, flames were visible through the haze. The house burned fiercely, far more intensely than its aged timber should have allowed. Fire climbed the walls with unnatural speed, consuming the structure from within. The roof collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The river hissed and steamed where burning debris fell into it. But the water did little to slow the destruction. He watched from a distance, his jaw clenched, as years of quiet intent vanished in minutes. When the fire crews arrived, they approached cautiously, wary of unstable currents and collapsing beams. Their efforts were largely symbolic. By the time water reached the flames, there was little left to save. The house had not been destroyed by accident, it had been erased. The official explanation followed almost immediately. Possible lightning strike, electrical fault from unknown wiring, abandoned structure compromised by age, hazard eliminated, no further investigation required, none of it matched what he had seen. The burn pattern was wrong, the intensity too uniform. Accelerant had been used, applied carefully to ensure complete destruction. This was not negligence, it was sanitation. Once the fire died down, he was allowed closer. Charred beams jutted from the river like blackened ribs. The deck had collapsed entirely, leaving only fragments clinging to the stilts. The interior was gone, reduced to ash and twisted metal. Binders, records, the table, the cot all erased beyond recovery. He waded carefully through the shallows at the edge, scanning what remained. Amid the debris, he found the metal anchors where the box had been secured. The bolts were scorched but intact, their paint burned away. The cavity beneath the floor had collapsed, filling with ash and charred fragments. Of the box itself, there was no sign. It had been removed before the fire. That fact settled over him with grim certainty. The purpose of the fire had not been to destroy the object. It had been to destroy context. Without the house, without the records, without the physical proof of long-term observation, the box could disappear back into abstraction. If it resurfaced later, stripped of its history, it could be dismissed, reclassified, or buried again through process. The ranger photographed everything: the burn patterns, the anchor points, the absence where the box should have been. He took notes while the details were fresh, aware that memory alone would not be enough. When he asked questions, the answers were vague, rehearsed, politely dismissive. The matter, he was told, was being handled. That evening, a second email arrived. It informed him that due to operational restructuring, he would be temporarily reassigned to a different sector, effective immediately. His current patrol area would be covered by others. No disciplinary action implied, merely an administrative adjustment. It was the final signal. He sat alone in his quarters, reviewing everything he had preserved. Photographs of the interior, images of the binders before and after pages vanished, notes on the box, copies of communications. It was not a complete record. It would never be. But it was enough to establish that something had existed, that it had been maintained deliberately, and that it had been removed with equal deliberation once noticed. The system had not threatened him openly. It had done something more effective. It had erased the ground beneath his claims and moved him aside, all while maintaining the appearance of order. He understood now that waiting would accomplish nothing. Silence would be interpreted as compliance. Whatever truth remained would dissolve slowly, scattered among agencies and explanations until no single thread could be followed. The fire had closed one chapter, but it had also clarified the stakes. Someone had decided that exposure was imminent enough to warrant action. That meant the balance had shifted. The question was no longer whether the truth mattered, but whether it could still be preserved in any meaningful form. As night settled and the distant sound of the river reached him through the open window, the ranger made his decision. He would not fight the system head-on. He would do something more difficult and more dangerous. He would ensure that what he had seen could not be erased simply by destroying a building or reassigning a man. The house was gone. The evidence was disappearing, but the knowledge remained. And knowledge once carried beyond the boundaries of a place that did not exist had a way of surfacing where it could no longer be quietly burned away. The reassignment order took effect at dawn. By the time the sun rose above the ridge, his access to the river sector had already been revoked in the system. Routes he had walked for years were no longer on his schedule. The change was framed as temporary, procedural, even considerate. He was being spared the inconvenience of an area now deemed resolved. But the message beneath the wording was unmistakable. The story was over. He was expected to move on. He did not. Instead, he treated the reassignment as a narrowing of time rather than an ending. The house was gone, the box removed, the records burned or taken, but the sequence of events could no longer be undone. The disappearance of evidence, the speed of the response, the precision of what had been erased, all of it pointed to intention. And intention left patterns. Patterns could be reconstructed. He spent the first days after the fire working quietly, assembling what remained into a coherent whole. Photographs were arranged chronologically, not by subject. Images of the house from the river, the interior before disturbance, the binders intact, the same shelves after pages had vanished, the anchor bolts exposed after the fire. Alongside them, he placed his notes, dated and time-stamped, and copies of internal communications that showed how concerns had been acknowledged without being acted upon. Individually, none of it proved wrongdoing. Together, it formed a narrative that could not be dismissed as coincidence. He reconstructed the timeline carefully. The original disappearance decades earlier, the abrupt closure of the case following the loss of a key piece of evidence, the quiet emergence of the house soon after, placed where jurisdiction dissolved, the beginning of long-term observation, not of nature, but of people, the transfer of responsibility from one observer to the next, each inheriting the task without formal authority. Then his arrival, his curiosity, the edits to the records, the removal of pages, the fire, the reassignment. Once written out, the logic was stark. The system had not failed. It had functioned exactly as designed. The ranger understood now that the greatest danger was not retaliation or loss of position. It was absorption. If he allowed his knowledge to remain within the same administrative boundaries that had concealed the truth for so long, it would be diluted, reframed, and eventually forgotten. The only way to preserve it was to move it somewhere the river's quiet jurisdictional magic could not reach. He considered his options with care. Internal affairs would be slow and constrained by the same structures that had enabled the concealment. Law enforcement agencies would focus on procedure rather than context, seizing on gaps to justify inaction. Journalists could bring attention, but attention without documentation could provoke denial rather than accountability. Each path carried risk, but risk was unavoidable now. The only choice left was which risk to accept. He chose distance. Using personal equipment rather than anything tied to his position, he created redundant copies of everything he had gathered. Digital files stored in separate locations. Physical prints sealed and labeled. He left one set with a trusted contact outside the park system, someone whose profession required discretion and whose curiosity was sharpened by patterns rather than authority. He sent another set to an independent review board that specialized in cold cases, framing the submission not as an accusation, but as a request for reevaluation based on newly surfaced inconsistencies. He did not include his name in that submission. The evidence would have to speak for itself. Only after those steps were taken did he prepare a formal report. It was not dramatic. It contained no accusations, no speculation about motives. It described observations, actions taken, evidence encountered, and evidence destroyed. It documented the reassignment and the fire with dates and times. It acknowledged uncertainty where certainty could not be proven. And at the end, it posed a single question, carefully worded, about the removal of an object that had been officially declared lost decades earlier. He submitted the report through channels that ensured it could not be quietly deleted without record. He knew what would happen next. The report would be reviewed. Committees would be formed. Jurisdiction would be debated. Responsibility would shift from one desk to another. The process would be slow, deliberate, and resistant. But it would exist. An existence once established was difficult to erase entirely. The response came weeks later, just as he expected. The report was acknowledged. Additional information requested, timelines questioned, certain conclusions labeled speculative. At the same time, subtle pressure mounted. Colleagues grew distant. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Opportunities quietly evaporated. He was no longer invited into discussions that once included him. The system did not punish him openly. It isolated him. He accepted it without protest. In quieter moments, he returned in his mind to the river. The place where the house had stood now appeared empty, indistinguishable from any other stretch of water. Debris from the fire had long since been carried away. To anyone passing by, nothing suggested that a structure had ever existed there at all. That was the river's final gift to those who relied on it. Erasure without trace. Yet erasure was never complete. The ranger knew that somewhere the box still existed. It had been moved, reclassified, or hidden again. Perhaps it would never surface. Perhaps it would be destroyed quietly years from now when memory faded further. But the fact of its existence had escaped the river's grasp. It lived now in documents, in copies, in questions that could no longer be answered with silence alone. He also knew that the observers who had once maintained the house were gone, their system dismantled not by exposure, but by obsolescence. The world had changed. Information traveled faster now. Jurisdictional gaps closed more quickly when illuminated. What had worked for decades might not work again. The final weight of the knowledge he carried was not fear, but responsibility. He understood why others before him had chosen to watch rather than act. Waiting felt safer. It felt patient. But patience, unchecked, became complicity. The house in the river had been built to wait forever. He had refused to let it. Months later, as he walked a new patrol route far from the river, his radio crackled with a fragment of news. An old disappearance case had been reopened. No details given, no explanation offered, just a brief mention, easy to miss if one was not listening carefully. He stopped walking and stared out across the trees, feeling the moment settle into him. The truth had not burst into daylight. It had surfaced slowly, the way objects sometimes rose from deep water long after they were dropped. Changed, weathered, but undeniable. The ranger resumed his patrol, his pace steady. He knew the outcome was uncertain. Reopened did not mean resolved. Accountability did not always follow discovery. But the balance had shifted, and that was enough. The most dangerous thing he had found beneath the floor of the house was not the object itself. It was the knowledge that truth could be hidden not by force, but by careful placement in a place no one was required to see. And now that he had seen it, he understood something else as well. Some places exist only to hide things, and sometimes the most necessary act is simply to acknowledge that such places were never meant to remain unseen. If this story kept you watching, subscribe to the channel for more true-style mysteries and hidden stories. Watch the next video to continue the journey and share this one with someone who loves real suspense. Don't forget to comment where you're watching from.